Subscribe! Screener provided by Third Window Films. A quick note before we start. This video is a review and analysis of Tezuka's Barbara. As such, there will be sections that contain some spoilers. However, I'll make sure you know when they're coming up and include chapters and time codes to skip to in order to experience a spoiler-free review. Also, I think you'll probably get the most out of this video after you've seen the film, as it's such a dense text and the aim here is to at least break some of that down. Either way though, it will hopefully provide some useful insight. Finally, the movie, and by extension this review, contains very adult and disturbing themes, and topics that will not be suitable for children, younger viewers, or any who are not a fan of such content. While Tezuka's Barbara would see initial release in Japan in 2019, before coming to the West a few years later, in order to fully analyse it, we have to go back over half a century before that, to the early 1950s. As post-war Japan continued to change and adapt to the new world which had been created by the global conflicts of the past decade or so, the beginnings of what we would come to know as modern anime and manga were taking shape. While anime has its true origins in 1917, with Namakura Gatana, and manga can be traced back even further, first forming as a concept as early as the late 1790s, it would be the post-war era that would give rise to many creations that would form the basis of what both manga and anime would become. And of these creations, few stand as more successful or more influential than Astro Boy. Starting in 1952, Astro Boy, or Mighty Atom as it's known in Japan, would become one of the most successful and well-known mangas across the world, and to this day is still $1 billion intellectual property. Following the story of a child android created by a father who recently lost his own child, Astro Boy entered the cultural zeitgeist with its unique brand of action, emotion, and socially relevant subject matter. It was the creation of Osamu Tezuka, one of Japan's most famous writers and illustrators. In the years that followed Astro Boy, Tezuka would create many more manga franchises, from Don Dracula to Duke Goblin. But amongst these many series, there was one that stood as wholly unique when compared to Tezuka's other creations. Barbara, the story of a troubled yet successful author as he seeks to regain his lost inspiration via a new mysterious muse, brought with it content more adult and disturbing. Indeed, the themes of obsession, sex, love, violence, misogyny, and possession all comprise a part of this challenging yet engaging subject matter. However, its complex nature, surrealist tendencies, abstract storytelling, and adult themes seem to make it not only divisive but also unadaptable into other mediums. That was, of course, until 2019. After Osamu Tezuka's death in 1989, another would rise up to both make their own name and act as warden to the Tezuka legacy. Makoto Tezuka, Osamu's eldest son, would begin working in filmmaking in the early 80s, before also adding teaching, anime, and consultation among other things to his resume. In a turn of events perhaps most fitting, Makoto would be the one to take on the mammoth and allegedly impossible task of adapting Barbara for the big screen, alongside Ultraman and Tokyo Noir writer Hisako Kurosawa. The results are a creation all its own, which successfully manages to distance itself from the source material enough to be considered a separate entity, with its own individual strengths, weaknesses, commendations, and mistakes. Yosuke Mikura is an author fast approaching middle age. He's seemingly seen a fair amount of success in his career before now, but has found himself lacking inspiration in recent times. Walking the streets of Shinjuku, he happens upon Barbara, who is seemingly a homeless woman laying in an underpass in a state of near unconsciousness. After stopping in his tracks and sharing a reflective moment with her in the quotation of poetry, the author invites Barbara back to his apartment. where she proceeds to continue to drink, start to trash the place a little, mock his writing, and subsequently get thrown out after taking a shower and drinking a fair amount of his good booze. What follows is an intense relationship and eventual obsession, as the author begins to forego all other aspects of his life in service of his infatuation with Barbara, and the Muse herself becomes increasingly more enigmatic. As Mikura lets his world fall apart, the nature of his very reality seems to destabilize, and what is real becomes an ever-present question, punctuated only by occasional harsh and adult realities. Filled with slow-burn atmosphere, surrealist tangents and imagery, and dark adult themes, Tezuka's Barbara aims to examine the relationship between an artist, their work, and their muse, as well as explore many connected themes such as sex, obsession, love, adoration, and self-loathing. But before we talk about if it succeeds in these goals, it's important to first contextualize the movie, as well as its inspirations. And it's here that we find ourselves going back even further, some 140 years removed from Barbara and Mikura's story. Right from its opening, Tezuka's Barbara wears its inspirations on its sleeve. After seeing a quote from philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche on the nature of love, madness, and obsession, we hear protagonist Yosuke Mikura's narration over beautiful, mood-setting shots of Shinjuku that carry with them an intangible murk and grime. But even with such a clear thematic opening, it's not long before the film's characters are quoting the poetry of Paul-Marie Verlaine, and the story begins to channel other inspirations. One such inspiration is the 1881 French fantasy opera The Tales of Hoffman by playwright Jacques Offenbach, and once familiar with it, it becomes pretty clear that Offenbach's work is perhaps the single biggest influence here. As just mentioned, The Tales of Hoffman first released in 1881, and only a few months before Offenbach himself died. Offenbach, for those who have never heard of him, was a German-born French composer, writer, and cellist who many believe to be one of the most influential figures in the history of opera and romantic literature. Also, as an interesting aside, due in no small part to one of the chapters contained within The Tales of Hoffman, his work is also often cited as one of the main origin texts for the steampunk subgenre. The Tales of Hoffman itself is actually 3 separate stories, amalgamated into a single opera, and tied together with a shared protagonist, the titular Hoffman, and a shared theme of falling in love. The first story, named Olympia, tells the story of Hoffman's infatuation and subsequent obsession with a mechanical doll. The second, named Antonia, details his similar feelings for a young and overtly dramatic young woman. And the third and final story, named Juliet, tells of his love for an older and more dominant woman. However, while these stories are distinct, the opera's narrative framing device, seen in its prologue and epilogue, indicates that these are in fact 3 sides to the same woman. In these prologue and epilogue sequences, Hoffman is distracted from his work as a poet and his current muse by falling for a woman named Stella. All 3 acts are then presented as stories within this story, narrated by Hoffman as the protagonist. Now, such structure and content brings with it many readings, some of which are very relevant to Tezuka's Barbara, and some of which are less so. For example, the focus on the 3 sides of the female persona seen in the Tales of Hoffman is clearly at least partially inspired by Christian ideology, and the 3 phases of Eve story from the Book of Genesis. But all of this is also relevant to Tezuka's Barbara, with the titular muse displaying all 3 of these elements at different points in the film. Such antiquated concepts have also informed other elements of Barbara's narrative. Another example can be seen just after Mikura and Barbara have their first sexual encounter, where the 2 enter a kitchen, naked, and Barbara takes a bite from an apple before they continue to make love. The way the sequence is shot and the obviousness of the imagery, again, is clearly here to evoke original sin and the story of Adam and Eve. However, the partial focus on these elements as the opinion of a clearly arrogant and sexist male protagonist does mediate things a little, but much like the Tales of Hoffman and the manga on which this movie is based, the movie cannot free itself completely of its sexist elements. Also, this is not where the similarities end. These are just a few of the main parallels that could be drawn between these 2 texts, and you could probably fill an entire video series just comparing them. But the point to take away from all this is that there are many narrative thematic elements seen in the Tale of Hoffman that are referenced or revisited in both Tezuka's Barbara and the manga from which it was adapted. And as we progress through this review and analysis, the importance of this as an inspiring text will only become more apparent. Both concern an author of some description finding a new object of their obsessive affection. Both deal with the damaging concept of equating sex with success. Both employ tangential storytelling that often delves into surrealist territories. And both channel antiquated, mainly Christian concepts of womanhood, either as the misogynistic content that it has always existed as, or as the misconceptions of an ignorant, self-absorbed and egotistical male protagonist. And it's when Tezuka's Barbara delves into the latter of these elements that it reinterprets such influences the best. Mikura is an admittedly successful, yet arrogant, sexist, selfish egotist, and when the film treats him as such, equating his actions and attitudes through such a lens, it succeeds in at least partially examining the artist's relationship with sex and the concept of romance. Unfortunately, other times it strays into a more antiquated and sexist territory, which not only feels inappropriate, but also out of place in a film that otherwise deals with some interesting themes. However, such elements feel more a byproduct of influence and mishandled concept than those of intent, and while this still shows a certain amount of ignorance, the nature of how interpretable many of these elements are mean they are far from overt. Other than the artist's relationship with their muse, Tezuka's Barbara also has another theme, that of the artist's relationship with their work. Mikura is clearly an author who has written the best books of his career and is now struggling to retain the level of artistic gratification that he once felt, perhaps when striving for such success. They say that success, wealth and happiness can be the worst thing for a creator, and such a concept is one on full display in this author's life. Moreover, this theme is further mirrored by Mikura's age, as he knows that not only his best work is behind him, but also probably the best years of his life. This understated nature is also mirrored in the way the film is shot, edited and scored, with long, dialogueless shots filled with a jazz score abruptly cutting to quieter moments, and atmospheric establishing shots used to continually create the right mood and atmosphere. All of this is sold well, with great performances by all involved, especially the two leads, Guro Inagaki and Fumi Nikaido, giving well-weighted, memorable performances. It's true the film is slow, but it's intentional, and it's clear that the filmmaker knew what he was doing in constructing the movie this way, letting it breathe where it needs to, and snapping the audience back into focus when required. As a depiction of the artist's struggle for gratification and fulfillment from their own work, Tezuka's Barbara succeeds on almost every level. Through its use of drama, surrealism, atmosphere, and even comedy, it masterfully captures the duality of ego and self-loathing that so often comes from success in any artistic medium. Its use of sex, alcohol, and materialism, juxtaposed with the overt embrace or harsh denial of these elements, only serves to heighten the impact of its messaging. And the downward spiral seen in its protagonist is one that comes across believable and almost inevitable. The slow dilapidation of his apartment and his own demeanour, the nature of all the relationships in his life, how much time he spends actually attempting to write, all of these elements can be seen in states of slow escalation or de-escalation throughout the film, and become only more poignant with the second watch. All of this serves to reinforce the changes in the author's character. As he rejects all those who care for him, his material possessions, and even his own self-care, Mikura is consumed by obsession, and while the film frames this obsession as one pointed at his new muse, I would posit that it is actually saying something else entirely. This section will contain the most spoilers, and is best saved for when you've seen the movie. If you want to avoid any of this, then skip to this timecode to hear the summation of this review and my final thoughts on the movie. So up until now, we've spoken quite literally about Tezuka's Barbara, its content, and its events, and that makes sense. But let's just assume for a moment that not everything is as it seems. What if Barbara is herself a figment of the author's imagination? A personification of the very artistic fulfillment he deep down knows he will either never attain or has killed himself through his own success? Now, I know what you're thinking, that's a bit far-fetched, but let's examine some evidence first. Firstly, no one else in Mikura's life actually sees or interacts with Barbara at all in the whole movie. The only people she speaks to, other than the author himself, are people that are only seen when he is alone with her, such as the people in the club or her mother. Second, it becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly that Mikura is capable of creating his own delusional realities. This is seen early on in the movie, with incidents involving a mannequin and a dog. Thirdly, there are several clear choices made throughout the story by the filmmaker to indicate that this theory might be correct. There's a moment where Mikura asks Barbara to boil the kettle, and when his colleague arrives, Barbara's nowhere to be seen, but the kettle is still boiling, indicating that perhaps he set it off himself. Or later in the movie, there's a part where Mikura goes to try and find Barbara, but upon arriving at what was once the door to where her mother resides, the author is greeted with a stone-washed wall that looks like it's always been there, and the door is nowhere to be found. Fourthly, there are certain explanations given that don't match up to what we see. For example, there is a part where Mikura is arrested for being at what appears to be a cult ritual. However, in the newspaper clipping we're provided, it simply states that he was arrested for taking drugs. And finally, there's Barbara's appearance. Throughout the entire film, she's dressed and presented like a mannequin. Her hair, the lack of blood when she's supposed to be wounded, the way she carries herself, even her clothes, look straight out of a shop window. All of this becomes even more pronounced in the film's final act, when her and the author arrive at a cabin. Without spoiling too much, as this sequence progresses, there are certain indications that Mikura is aging, but she is not. All of this would also tie back, once again, to the Olympia story in the Tales of Hoffman opera, given that story's use of an animated mannequin of sorts. Reframing the film with this in mind allows for a different, and in my opinion, a more interesting view of events. Contextualized this way, Barbara doesn't necessarily represent an egotist's view of womankind, but instead an artist's pursuit and ultimate destruction of their own elusive potential, viewed through the eyes of an unstable and delusional mind that is not only losing touch with reality, but has also forgotten who they were or what they were trying to say with their work in the first place. While it might be that Mikura is a self-centered egotist with little respect for women, he is also a self-loathing, lost and sad person in the midst of a breakdown, whose opinions and experiences become ever less valid and ever more thematically poignant with each passing minute of the film's runtime. While it doesn't excuse all of Tezuka's Barbara's messaging, it seems to make sense as a concept for this obtuse narrative and mediate much of the content, having it instead exist as the opinions and delusions of one troubled individual. So with all that said, it's now time to answer the most important of questions, and that's, is Tezuka's Barbara worth your time? Well, overall, I'd say the answer is a resounding yes, albeit with a few caveats. Firstly, it's worth reiterating that this movie is extremely adult in its themes and content, so only those of a certain age need apply. Second, it's not an easy watch, with a slow pace, surrealist tangents, obfuscated narrative elements, and very disturbing sequences. It won't be everyone's cup of tea. And third, it can't quite shake some of the negative elements seen in both its original iteration or its inspirations, with some parts of the movie that come off at best antiquated and at worst straight up sexist. But while these elements can hinder the experience, they're nowhere near common enough or prevalent enough to ruin its positive elements, and as discussed earlier, are often framed not as the film's message, but as the flawed views of its troubled protagonist. Separate from this though, Tezuka's Barbara is an interesting and enrapturing meditation on the relationship of the artist and their work, what it takes to be satisfied, and coming to terms with having not necessarily understood what intangible element made you most appealing in the first place. While its pacing is slow, its content often uncomfortable, its themes and narrative obscured, and its finale soberingly depressing, none of these elements are necessarily criticisms. They're just not going to be for everyone. Its great performances, fantastic atmosphere, and clear command of all its elements of production culminate in an experience that anyone looking for a slow, adult, and introspective piece should definitely check out. But perhaps most impressively, Tezuka's Barbara successfully manages to adapt a text previously considered unfilmable and make it stand out on its own terms without losing the elements that tie it to the source material. While it doesn't all hang together perfectly, and there are some elements that miss the mark or feel very outdated, it is nonetheless a fascinating and engaging tale that will stay with you long after the credits roll. Thanks for watching guys, and thanks again to 3 Window Films for providing me with a review screener. I did want to get this review out quicker, but it escalated a little once I started having to watch 19th century French opera as part of my analysis. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, then please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. The movie coverage on the channel is going to be increasing over the coming months, but of course I'll also still be covering video games, as well as hopefully books and comics as well. Thanks again, stay safe out there.